The Animal Justice Party is proud to move a disallowance motion against these sham biosecurity regulations, which are part of a sustained and misguided attack by the government on animal advocates in this country. While the world burns in a state of climate emergency, and while drought and bushfires rage across our rural communities and decimate native animal populations, it is truly hard to believe that this is what the government has chosen to prioritise. Attacking a group of brave advocates who are dedicated to stopping animal suffering and who are deeply concerned about the hidden cruelty in the animal agriculture industry. Because let's be clear, despite the name, these regulations have nothing to do with biosecurity and everything to do with stopping transparency in the intensive animal agribusiness industry. The government have made no attempt to hide their motives about that. Although we already have biosecurity and trespass laws in place that appropriately impose penalties for those who choose to risk going onto private property without permission, the government is intent on further targeting and attacking people who are trying to protect animals from cruelty, regardless of the consequences. Of course, these regulations could never really be about biosecurity, because trespass by animal advocates has not been shown. There's not been shown a single cause of a single biosecurity incident. In those rare incidents where advocates have illegally entered onto animal agribusiness facilities, they take serious biosecurity precautions, probably greater precautions than many farmers or other people who come onto agricultural property, because they actually care about the safety and well-being of these animals. If they didn't, they wouldn't be risking being there in the first place. These regulations also ignore the fact that the biggest cause of farm trespass, according to the New South Wales Police, is not animal advocates, but illegal hunters. People who are going onto private, rural land, almost invariably with guns, to hunt and intentionally kill animals for fun. These people who are most certainly least unlikely to be taking any biosecurity precautions before entering a rural property. But despite this, you don't see anyone in this government going to the media and calling hunters thugs and vigilantes or domestic terrorists. That offensive language is reserved for people who actually care about animals, who expose the horrific conditions they are kept in animal agribusiness, and who rescue them when authorities fail to act. Our laws are so weak we allow hens and pigs to live in cages, meat birds to live in piles of faeces that will burn through their feathers and then their skin. It's the people who want to stop this that the government calls names. It is the compassionate people in our society who the government is trying to shut down and shut up with this piece of regulation. And while we have seen, and will no doubt continue to see, regulation after regulation and bill after bill attacking animal advocates in this state, I remind everyone in this place that New South Wales continues to have the second lowest penalties for animal cruelty in the country, the second lowest. This leads to a completely cruel and unjust situation whereby someone going into a piggery or a battery hen facility to expose animal cruelty can face up to $220,000. As the person who exposed animal cruelty. However, the person who was actually cruel to the animal themselves could only face a maximum of $5,500 or up to 6 months imprisonment. And that doesn't even begin to take into account the suffering of the animals involved. One day, we will look back at regulations like this and realise that repressive actions were not the answer. There is growing community awareness and concern about the way animals are treated, and trying to shut people up will only make people more determined to stop oppression and the cruel treatment of millions of animals in this country. In conclusion, I urge the House to support this disallowance motion and get rid of these regulations that will do nothing to improve biosecurity in this state and will only serve to reduce transparency in the animal agriculture sector and continue to allow industry to cover up horrific animal cruelty.
Minister has the call. The Biosecurity Amendment, Biosecurity Management Plans Regulation 2019 is the first step of this government to protect our hard-working farmers from the risks posed by unauthorised entry to their property. This inevitably captures trespassers who illegally enter a property without consulting with the landowner to understand their biosecurity duties in a biosecurity management plan. In April 2019, we saw large-scale coordinated protests target farming properties and animal processing facilities across our country. The tactics of animal welfare groups are aggressive and they are malicious. They bully and they intimidate and they threaten farming families. They're not interested in reform. They're interested in shutting down an entire industry. They seek to undermine our farming communities and drive them out of business. This is despite our farmers being the source of the very food that they eat. Irrespective of their views on farming, this regulation will inevitably capture protesters who turn themselves into trespassers by choosing to unlawfully conduct themselves.
Mr Deputy President, I rise to lead for the opposition on the disallowance motion moved by the Animal Justice Party. These plans will affect shearers. Shearers go onto farms. They will go off and on to conduct their activity. These biosecurity management plans are going to affect truck drivers, council and utility workers. Where these biosecurity management plans fall down, in my view, is I don't think there's enough rigour around the development of them, and I don't think there's enough rigour around the knowledge of where they can be found. What I would say to the government is take heed to this debate. Take heed of this debate. There are a number of matters that have been raised that require government action. Don't think you've got it right, because you haven't. But does it mean we throw them out? No, it doesn't. The opposition will be opposing the disallowance.
The Greens support the disallowance of the Biosecurity Management Plans Regulation 2019. It's pretty disappointing to see this government exploit the very serious issue of biosecurity to run interference for animal cruelty, and in the process setting up this pretty irresponsible and illusory battle between farmers and animal activists. If anyone still doubts that this is not actually about biosecurity, the government's own webpage relating to this regulation has a series of frequently asked questions that almost entirely relate to trespass and not biosecurity. Not trespass of illegal hunters, not trespass of thieves. Their real concern is people exposing animal abuse. If this government seriously wants to stop people trespassing, let's stop abusing animals. Let's increase transparency around intensive animal farming. Let's improve the investigation and enforcement powers in relation to the protection of animals. And let's establish an independent animal welfare regulator to protect animals from cruelty.
The Animal Justice Party does not want to see farmed animals suffer from the spread of diseases such as avian influenza, foot and mouth disease, Newcastle disease, and of course the latest concern being African swine fever, which has already devastated 25% of the world's pig farm population. However, we consider animal agriculture production itself is the greatest risk to human health, not animal activists entering facilities in order to expose cruelty and the often unsanitary conditions in which animals are kept. The Federal Department of Agriculture lists 98 notifiable diseases, which, if we needed the reminder, the farming of animals creates significant and growing risks, not only to animals, but also to the human population via zoonosis. It is most likely that the next human pandemic will be as a result of the mutation of either avian or swine flu with the capacity to infect the human population. The World Health Organization has made it very clear with avian influenza, which, if it infects a person, will kill 53% of infected people. A shed that houses 22,000 birds is a ripe petri dish with these blood-enriched lungs for the avian influenza virus to mutate to become airborne. The World Health Organization has stated that if this occurs, and it is highly likely to with intensive farming, then we will have avian influenza pandemic amongst our society. There is also the problem of the overuse of antibiotics in agriculture, animal agriculture, threatening human health. According to the World Health Organization, antibiotic resistance is one of the biggest threats to global health, food security and development today. I myself took samples of feed from a typical intensive poultry farm over a period of the 42 weeks which the birds grow. The tests revealed 3 coccidiostats, which are antibiotic-like substances, 3 different drugs used over a 42-week period in a typical growing of meat chickens. Millions of animals are at risk of sickness and death so long as we continue to create the perfect vectors for disease in the intensive chicken and pig agriculture facilities, where animals are routinely fed these substances. The Animal Justice Party argues that the safest and best biosecurity plan is to phase out animal agriculture and a transition to plant-based agriculture. To add to the confusion, the plans are not required to be on display. All that is required is that a sign that is conspicuously posted at each entrance and contains contact details of the person from whom the plan can be obtained, or not. How is this anything but ridiculous in apparently addressing biosecurity? So, as I have stated before, the farmer, the agriculture meat grower, needs to be looking into their backyard and what's happening in their sheds if they're really concerned about disease and biosecurity, not the front or the back gate. If the government was serious about addressing biosecurity, they would be putting resources into farm inspections and regulations that put pressure on the industry to reduce wholesale use of antibiotics as a solution to the overcrowded and unhealthy conditions of intensive facilities. All of this, for what the Animal Justice Party argues, is a smokescreen to target only one kind of visitor: those members of the public who feel compelled to expose both the routine and egregious animal cruelty that is endemic, pervasive and systemic in the animal agriculture industries, and they are there because the regulatory authorities are failing the animals. We propose a safe and practical solution: the introduction of mandatory CCTV cameras covering all critical points of animal welfare and linked to the Food Authority for viewing remotely in real time. Live CCTV footage would do much to address the concern of animal activists, as well as reducing farmers' fears of trespass, and would put to bed any worries about biosecurity risk from activists and others.
In reality, this debate is something of a proxy and a preamble to the considerations we'll have about the Minister's excellent Right to Farm bill later in proceeding. And could I just say to Animal Justice that they are a political organisation that has a story to tell, and they do garner support. But in my opinion, it's support for argument, persuasion and changes to policy, rather than support for anarchy and feral activities that can only end very, very badly through these farm invasions. For Animal Justice, the argument they have and the information they present is always useful and interesting, and even tough nuts like myself have learned a lot in the last 6 months. But I won't be supporting anarchy. I won't be supporting feral activities. I won't be supporting farm invasions to make the point.
Mr President, I rise to support the disallowance motion brought by the Honourable Emma Hurst. Can I say we wouldn't be here having this argument about the disallowance of this resolution in the context of animal activism if the regulator, the Department of Primary Industry, did its job, especially in terms of regulating for the welfare of the industrial livestock industry, where we have a pretend regulator. There's been the process of what's called regulatory capture. The regulator now so closely identifies itself with the industries that it's regulating, particularly the intensive livestock industries, that it can't do its job properly with any kind of objectivity, and particularly it is failing to protect the welfare of the millions and millions of animals that this parliament has placed in its care. And for that reason, we are seeing activists having to go and obtain the evidence themselves to show to the public the systemic brutality that too often happens in parts of the industrial livestock industry. It could be literally made up, written on toilet paper on the dunny one day. It could be written on the back of an envelope and stuck on the fridge. Those would all be potentially valid biosecurity plans under this regulation. There's no requirement for public notice. There's no requirement for them to be published. It is literally amateur hour stuff. Mr Deputy President, these are woeful regulations. It's shameful the opposition is supporting them. Shameful they're supporting them. It is shameful that the government pretends this is a solution to farmers. It is shameful that they're suggesting that they're fit for purpose, and we very much support the disallowance motion.
In my view, this regulation makes a mockery, really, of the importance of biosecurity for the purposes, it seems, of furthering the National Party's efforts to just simply outdo the shooters and fishers, and now apparently One Nation as well, in their joint farm invasion to get the vegans campaign. We've seen it rolled out now over the last 12 or 18 months, particularly coming from the National Party, backed up by the Liberal Party in coalition, and being driven, I think, absurdly by this opposition that's been picked up in the bush by the shooters and fishers and now One Nation. And it is not in the interests of the farmers of this state, and it's not in the interests of good rules and laws as it relates to biosecurity. It's optional to create plans. It's optional what's in the plans. The plans may or may not deal with all or even the most critical biosecurity risks on all or part of that property. They can be adopted by farmers with not a basic check by a qualified person and seem to not even be required to meet a particular standard. There's no public register, either of properties that have a plan or of the plans themselves. They're not required to provide the plan if asked for it, even to a neighbour who might be impacted by a shoddy plan. How does this advance biosecurity in this state? This doesn't help, and in that way it potentially makes it worse because it gives a false sense of security to people on the land that this does something, and it doesn't.
Since introducing the new aggravating offence under the Enclosed Lands Protection Act, we have seen farm trespass continue and new tactics adopted, such as using online forums like Aussie Farms and crowdfunding campaigns to encourage and finance farm trespass. As such, this government introduced the Right to Farm Bill 2019 to protect primary producers from unauthorised entry onto enclosed agricultural lands. And this is the crux. No matter what one thinks of the motivation or justification for this bill, what is blindingly clear is this: anything that results in more farm trespass also increases the likelihood of crippling biosecurity impacts. With this regulation, the government is ensuring every possible protection is in place to secure good biosecurity practices in this state.
Many protest activities involve protesters moving from one farm to another, often visiting multiple farms in the course of an evening. This risks the spread of disease. If someone has a legitimate animal welfare concern, which I'm sure all members of the House share, they can and should contact the New South Wales Police or the RSPCA.
I can't help but think that at the heart of the criticism of this regulation, indeed the push for a disallowance, is a lack of trust in our farming community. And this goes to the heart of a lot of the objections from the Animal Justice Party and the Greens in areas like environmental management, right through to how they grow their crops, how they treat their animals. And I think that's regrettable. I think it's very regrettable, because the reality is 99% of farmers run a business, and at the heart of that business is a responsible attitude towards their environment and a responsible attitude towards their management of their crop rotation and the management of their animals. Their livelihood is not put at risk by farm invasions, by bunch of militant vigilantes, be they at the behest of the animal protectionists or the behest of vegan, climate change, organic materials, whoever they might be. The reality is these are businesses that have a right to exist and a right to be protected and to go on doing what they do legally, which is their province, providing us with the fibre and the food that we take for granted in our communities. So I think it's very important that we stand up for our farmers, that we call out this left-wing vigilante sort of slant that the members of the Animal Justice Party giggle about in my presence. The reality is, you know, farmers should just be left to get on with their business. I do note, Mr Deputy President, that you know, the continuation of targeting of farms, the continuation of this vigilante sort of approach to regulation, so-called regulation by people like the animal protection groups, is something that is unnecessary. There are regulators already in place whose responsibility it is to ensure that appropriate practices are in place. And you'll note that under the
Order on both sides.
And you'll note that under the regulation, it makes provision for appropriate inspection by relevant authorities. Local land services, the police, emergency services and a whole range of other organisations have access to a farmer's property, irrespective of what might be in the management plan. And
the description by the Honourable Bonnie Taylor of advocates as bullies shows how out of touch the government truly is with the views of the New South Wales community who deeply care about animals, and is further evidence that the government is just calling people names when they stand up for animals. This is something I highlighted in my speech, and in her response, the Minister has just gone on to more name-calling. Not quite the mature response that I would hoped for. I'd also like to address some of the odd comments made by the Honourable Mick Beach that the Animal Justice Party supports illegal hunting by opposing this regulation. I think it's clear that Labor may have entirely missed the point of our disallowance. Biosecurity risks are caused by hunters, not animal advocates. In fact, the government might be happy to hear that we don't actually oppose biosecurity at all, which throws out most of the arguments they put forward for this regulation. Our point is that this regulation is not the way to do it. If the government really wanted to stop biosecurity issues, plans would be mandatory and robust and written by experts in criminal legislation. This regulation will do nothing to genuinely support farmers or reduce biosecurity risks, and will only serve to create further tension and suspicion around the issue of transparency in the intensive animal agriculture industry. The Honourable Matthew Mason-Cox also made points in regards to the current enforcement and protection that is already in place. However, why would anybody be going in and filming this cruelty, the issues going on behind industries such as the horse racing industry, such as slaughterhouses, such as intensive farms, and showing the world if there was proper enforcement and proper transparency? If we provide transparency in these industries, you will actually stop trespass from occurring in the first place. If we really wanted to stop trespass, increase transparency. I will conclude by reminding people in this place that according to the federal government's own survey earlier this year, 95% of people in the country view farm animal welfare with concern, and 91% want reform to address this. It's time to start listening to people and introduce laws that increase transparency of the lives of animals who currently have short, horrific and torturous lives inside intensive factory farms. If this were to happen, then the government would not need to use these kinds of sham biosecurity regulations to deter trespass by animal advocates, because there would be no need.
There being 6 ayes and 33 noes, the question is resolved in the negative. Unlock the doors.